Alara Whitmore stood at the tall window of Ashbourne Manor, watching rain fall over fields that stretched further than she could see. 5 years had passed since she became a duchess, and in those 5 years, her husband had spoken to her less than 50 times. She counted once, in a quiet moment of despair, and stopped when the number became too painful to hold. The letter in her hand had arrived that morning. It was written in the same careful, distant hand she had grown used to. Duke Roderick Ashbourne regretted that he would not be able to return for her birthday. Business in London required his attention. He hoped she was well. He signed it simply, Roderick. She folded the letter and placed it with the others in the small wooden box she kept in her writing desk. There were 17 letters in that box now, each one nearly the same as the last. Each one a reminder that she had married a man who had chosen to forget her. The marriage had been arranged when she was 19. Her family's fortune had crumbled after her father's failed investments, and the Ashbourne name carried enough wealth and power to save them from ruin. Roderick's family needed the alliance too, though for different reasons that were never fully explained to her. On paper, it made sense. 2 families, both saved. A young woman handed from one house to another, expected to be grateful. She had been grateful, in the beginning. Roderick was not unkind on their wedding day. He had looked at her with something that might have been respect, even warmth. She remembered the way he had taken her hand as they walked from the chapel, how his fingers had been careful and gentle around hers. For a moment, she had believed that perhaps this marriage, though built on necessity rather than love, might grow into something real. That night, before she had even removed her wedding veil, a messenger arrived. War had broken out along the northern border, and every able officer was called to serve immediately. Roderick, holding a military commission he rarely spoke of, was among the first names on the list. He left before dawn, before their marriage had truly begun, and Alara spent her wedding night alone in a manor that did not yet feel like home. The war lasted 2 years. When it ended, Alara believed her husband would finally return to her, that the 2 of them could begin the life they had been promised. He did come back, but he was not the same man who had left. Something in him had changed, hardened, closed off in a way she could not reach. He stayed at Ashbourne Manor for only a few weeks before finding reasons to travel again. Business with distant relatives, matters at Parliament, investments that required his personal attention. The excuses varied, but the result was always the same. He was never there. At first, Alara wrote to him constantly. She asked about his health, told him small stories about the estate, the gardens she had begun to tend, the tenants she had come to know. His replies grew shorter each time, until eventually they became formal notices rather than letters, simple statements of his continued absence. She stopped writing after the 3rd year. There seemed little point in pouring her heart into pages that were met with silence. The staff at Ashbourne Manor treated her with a strange mixture of respect and pity. She was their duchess, and they served her faithfully, yet she often caught glances exchanged between the housekeeper and the butler when Roderick's name was mentioned. Nobody spoke openly about it, but everyone understood. The Duke had a wife he did not want, in a marriage he had never truly entered. Rumors reached her from time to time, carried on the tongues of visiting relatives, or overheard from servants who had traveled with the Duke to London. He kept company with a woman named Charlotte Vane, a widow known throughout society for her beauty and her sharp wit. Alara did not know if the rumors were true, and she found, to her own surprise, that she was no longer certain she cared. The ache of jealousy had faded years ago, replaced by something quieter and more permanent. A kind of resignation, a distance from her own life that let her survive it. She busied herself instead with what she could control. The gardens at Ashbourne Manor bloomed under her care, rows of roses and lavender that she planted with her own hands. She learned to read the estate ledgers, discovering an unexpected talent for numbers and management that impressed even the steward who had served the family for decades. She visited the tenant farms, learned the names of every child born on Ashbourne land, brought medicine and blankets to families who struggled through hard winters. In these small ways, she built a life that belonged entirely to her, separate from the husband who had abandoned it. Still, there were nights when the loneliness pressed on her chest like a physical weight. Nights when she sat by the fire in her private sitting room and wondered what she had done to deserve such indifference. She had never been unkind to Roderick. She had never given him reason to dismiss her so completely. In her quieter, more honest moments, she wondered if perhaps the fault was not in anything she had done, but simply in who she was. Not clever enough, not beautiful enough, not interesting enough to hold the attention of a man who could have chosen differently, had circumstances allowed it. Her closest companion during these years was Margaret Ellison, the housekeeper's daughter, who had grown from a shy young girl into a warm and clever woman close to Alara's own age. Margaret did not treat her as a duchess so much as a friend, and it was Margaret who often coaxed her out of her darker moods, who reminded her that there was still laughter to be found in small things, a garden in bloom, a well-written book, the sound of children playing near the stables. On the morning of her 24th birthday, the day the 17th letter arrived, Margaret found her standing at the window and gently suggested that she come to the county fair being held in the village that weekend. It had become a tradition, a gathering of local families, merchants and travelers, who came together each autumn to celebrate the harvest. Alara had attended in years past, mostly to be seen fulfilling her duties as duchess, greeting tenants and offering polite conversation, before returning quickly to the quiet of the manor. This year, she almost declined. The letter from Roderick had left her in a heavier mood than usual, a fresh reminder of everything her marriage was not. But Margaret's insistence, paired with a genuine desire to escape the walls of Ashbourne Manor for even a single afternoon, convinced her to agree. She dressed simply for the occasion, choosing a plain green dress rather than anything that marked her too clearly as nobility. It was a small act of rebellion, wanting for just one day to walk among people, without the weight of her title pressing down on every interaction. Margaret accompanied her, and together they made their way into the village where the fair had already filled the square with color and sound. Stalls lined the streets, selling fresh bread, wool blankets, carved wooden toys, and ribbons in every shade imaginable. Children ran between the crowds, laughing, chasing a small dog that had slipped its leash. Musicians played near the fountain, and couples danced on the cobblestones despite the slight chill in the autumn air. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Alara felt something loosen in her chest. Here, surrounded by strangers who did not know her as the neglected duchess, she was simply a woman enjoying an afternoon in the sun. She wandered from stall to stall, admiring handmade lace, sampling honey cakes offered by a smiling baker's wife, listening to an old man tell stories of his years at sea to a circle of wide-eyed children. Margaret drifted nearby, occasionally pointing out something of interest, but largely allowing Alara the space to simply exist without expectation. It was near the edge of the fair, by a stall selling books and old maps, that Alara's attention was caught by a man standing with his back to her, examining a leather-bound volume with careful interest. There was nothing immediately remarkable about him, no obvious sign of wealth or title in his plain traveling coat, yet something in the way he held himself, calm and unhurried, drew her eye. When he turned, she found herself looking into a pair of warm brown eyes that crinkled slightly at the corners as he offered her a polite smile, the kind one might give to a stranger sharing the same small pleasure of browsing old books on a pleasant afternoon. Neither of them spoke at first. He simply nodded in greeting, the natural courtesy shared between strangers, and returned his attention to the book in his hands. Alara moved closer to the stall, curiosity pulling her toward the worn spines of forgotten stories, and it was there, among pages yellowed with age, that her life began, without her knowing it yet, to quietly change course. She picked up a small volume of poetry, flipping through its pages with idle interest, unaware that the stranger beside her had glanced her way more than once, something thoughtful crossing his expression each time. Neither of them could have guessed, in that ordinary moment beside a stall of old books, how deeply their paths were about to intertwine, or how much both their lives were about to be reshaped by a single afternoon at the county fair. The stranger set down the leather-bound book and turned fully toward her, his expression open and curious, in a way that Alara had almost forgotten people could be. "Forgive me," he said, his voice warm and unhurried, "but I could not help noticing your interest in poetry. Most visitors to this stall are searching for maps or almanacs. It is rare to find someone drawn to verse." Alara felt a small smile tug at her lips, unguarded and genuine. "I suppose I have always found comfort in words that do not try to explain too much," she said. "Poetry leaves room for a reader to feel what she needs to feel." "A wise way to look at it," he replied. He extended a hand, though not in the formal manner of nobility, greeting nobility, but simply as one person meeting another. "Julian Faircross." "Alara," she said, offering only her first name, unwilling for the moment to let her title color the conversation. They spoke for a while beside the bookstall, exchanging small opinions on the volumes displayed before them. Julian had a gentle way of listening, tilting his head slightly when she spoke, as though her words carried real weight. He asked questions and waited patiently for her answers, rather than rushing to fill silences with his own voice, a habit she found she had almost forgotten existed in the men she had known. He mentioned, in passing, that he had grown up not far from the village, though he had spent many years away serving with the Navy before returning to manage his family's smaller estate to the east. There was an ease in the way he spoke of his life, no boasting, no attempt to impress her with grand accomplishments, simply an honest account offered because she had shown interest. "And you?" he asked eventually. "Do you live nearby, or are you visiting for the fair?" Alara hesitated only a moment before answering. "I live at Ashbourne Manor," she said, watching his expression carefully. Something shifted in his face, a flicker of surprise quickly followed by recognition. "Ashbourne," he repeated softly. "Then you must be the Duchess." She nodded, bracing herself for the change she had seen so often in others once her title became known, the sudden stiffness, the careful formality that replaced natural conversation. But Julian's demeanor did not change in that way. Instead, something like concern passed briefly across his features. "I apologize if I have spoken too freely," he said. "I did not realize I was addressing a duchess." "Please do not apologize," Alara said quickly. "I have had quite enough formality to last a lifetime." It was rather nice, for a moment, to simply be Alara. Julian studied her for a long moment, as though weighing whether to say more. "I knew your brother," he said finally. "William and I served together, briefly, before he returned home. He spoke of you often. He was proud of his sister, the one who could outread every officer in his regiment. The mention of her late brother, who had passed from fever 3 years earlier, brought a sudden ache to her chest, though it was not entirely unwelcome. Few people spoke of William to her anymore, and hearing his name from someone who had known him, even briefly, felt like a small gift. "He always exaggerated my accomplishments," she said softly, though her voice carried warmth rather than sadness. "I doubt that," Julian said. "He was not a man given to exaggeration. If anything, I suspect he undersold you." They continued walking together through the fair, no longer confined to the bookstall, wandering past vendors selling roasted chestnuts and hand-carved figurines. Margaret trailed a respectful distance behind, offering Alara privacy while remaining close enough to satisfy propriety. Alara found herself laughing more freely than she had in years, genuinely delighted by Julian's easy humor and the sincerity with which he engaged in even the smallest topics. He told her stories from his years at sea, tales of storms weathered and strange ports visited, always careful to include small details that made the stories feel real rather than embellished for effect. She told him about her gardens, about the tenant families she had come to know, about the small library she had built in one wing of Ashbourne Manor, using books she had collected over the years. He listened, as though every word mattered, and something in her, something that had been quiet and folded away for a very long time, began to unfurl. As the afternoon light softened into early evening, they found themselves near the edge of the village green, where a small crowd had gathered to watch children play a game involving hoops and wooden sticks. Julian and Alara stood side by side, watching the game, comfortable in a silence that felt entirely different from the silences she had grown used to at Ashbourne Manor. Those silences had always felt heavy, full of things unsaid and feelings unacknowledged. This silence felt light, easy, filled with the simple pleasure of shared company. "May I ask you something personal?" Julian said eventually, his tone careful. Alara turned to him, curious. "You may ask. I cannot promise I will answer." He offered a small, understanding smile before continuing. "Forgive me if this oversteps, but I have heard whispers, as one does in these parts, about the Duke's long absences. I do not wish to pry into matters that are not mine to know, but I find myself concerned, seeing you here today, that perhaps those whispers carry some truth." Alara considered deflecting the question, offering some polite excuse about her husband's important duties in London. It was the answer she had given countless times before, to relatives, to neighbors, to anyone who dared to ask about the state of her marriage, But something about Julian's genuine concern, free of judgment or gossip-hungry curiosity, made her want to answer honestly for once. "The whispers are true," she said quietly. "My husband and I have lived largely separate lives since our marriage began. He has his reasons, I suppose, though he has never fully explained them to me. I have simply learned to build a life of my own within the space he has left behind." Julian was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a gentleness that nearly undid her composure entirely. "That must be a very lonely way to live." The simple honesty of his words struck her more deeply than she expected. She had grown so accustomed to hiding the loneliness, to presenting a composed and capable face to the world, that hearing someone acknowledge it so plainly felt almost overwhelming. She blinked back an unexpected sting of tears and forced a small, steady breath. "I have managed," she said simply. "Managing and living are not always the same thing," Julian replied, though he said it kindly, without any hint of criticism directed at her. "I only mean to say that you deserve more than managing, my lady. Anyone would." They did not speak further on the subject that afternoon. Instead, Julian gently guided the conversation toward lighter topics, sensing perhaps that she needed the space to gather herself again. He told her about a mischievous dog he had once owned during his years at sea, a small terrier that had somehow charmed the entire crew, despite its habit of stealing food from the officers' quarters. Alara laughed again, grateful for the shift, and found herself grateful too for his quiet perceptiveness, his ability to know exactly when to press gently and when to step back. As the sun began to set and the fair slowly wound toward its close, Julian walked with her and Margaret to the edge of the village, where the carriage from Ashbourne Manor waited to take them home. He helped her into the carriage with practiced courtesy, his hand steady and warm beneath hers for the brief moment their fingers touched. "I hope we might meet again," he said, standing at the carriage door, "perhaps under less crowded circumstances." "I would like that," Alara admitted, surprising herself with the honesty of her own answer. Julian smiled, a genuine and unguarded expression that seemed to reach fully into his eyes. "Then I shall find a reason to call upon Ashbourne Manor soon. I understand your steward has been seeking advice on matters of crop rotation, and I happen to have some small experience in that area from managing my own estate." Alara laughed softly at the transparency of his excuse, though she found she did not mind it in the least. "I shall look forward to your visit, Mr. Faircross." "Julian," he corrected gently, "if I am to visit as a friend, I would prefer you use my given name." "Julian, then," she said, testing the sound of it, finding that she liked the way it felt. The carriage pulled away from the village, and Alara turned to watch Julian's figure grow smaller in the fading light, his hand raised in a final farewell. Margaret, seated across from her, watched with a knowing expression that she wisely chose not to voice aloud, though the small smile playing at her lips said enough. As the manor came into view through the carriage window, Alara felt something she had not felt in a very long time, a quiet flicker of hope, fragile but undeniably present. She did not yet know what it meant, or where it might lead, but for the first time in 5 long years, she found herself looking forward to what tomorrow might bring, rather than simply enduring it. That night, as she prepared for bed in her private chambers, Alara found herself thinking not of the 17th letter still sitting in her writing desk, nor of the husband who had chosen absence over presence for half a decade, but of warm brown eyes and an easy laugh, of a man who had looked at her not as a duchess or an obligation, but simply as a woman worth listening to. She fell asleep that night with a small, unfamiliar smile still resting on her lips, unaware that word of her afternoon at the fair had already begun to travel far beyond the village square, carried on whispers that would soon reach ears she had never expected to hear them. Word traveled quickly through the county, as it always did in places where everyone knew everyone else's business. Within a week of the fair, the story of the Duchess of Ashbourne walking arm in arm with a handsome baron had reached nearly every drawing room within a day's ride. The tale grew with each retelling, as such tales often do, until by the time it reached the more distant estates, it had transformed from an innocent afternoon conversation into something far more scandalous than the truth deserved. Lady Prudence Harlow, a distant cousin of the Ashbourne family known throughout the region for her sharp tongue and sharper opinions, was among the first to carry the news to London. She arrived at a gathering hosted by Charlotte Vane, the very woman rumored to hold Roderick's attention during his long absences from Ashbourne Manor, and delivered the story with the particular relish of someone who enjoys being the bearer of interesting news. "You would not believe it," Prudence said, settling into a velvet chair with a cup of tea balanced delicately in her hand. "The Duchess of Ashbourne, walking the length of the county fair on the arm of Baron Faircross, laughing and carrying on as though she had not a care in the world. My own sister witnessed the entire display." Charlotte Vane, seated near the window with her needlework resting forgotten in her lap, felt something tighten in her chest that she did not immediately wish to examine. She had known Roderick for nearly 3 years, ever since he had begun spending his long absences from Ashbourne in the company of London society. Their relationship had never been formally acknowledged, existing instead in the comfortable space between friendship and something deeper that neither of them had ever named aloud. She had told herself, more than once, that his marriage was simply a formality, a business arrangement that held no real claim on his heart. Yet the news of his wife finding companionship elsewhere struck her with an unexpected sharpness. Surely it was nothing more than idle conversation, Charlotte said, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. "Perhaps," Prudence allowed, though her tone suggested she believed otherwise. "Though I have heard that Baron Faircross has since called upon Ashbourne Manor twice this week alone, under the guise of discussing agricultural matters with the steward. Twice, in a single week. I hardly think crop rotation requires such frequent consultation." The conversation continued around Charlotte, but she found herself only half listening, her mind circling back again and again to the image of Roderick's wife, a woman she had always imagined as quiet and forgettable, now suddenly the subject of such interesting gossip. She had met Alara only once, years earlier, at a formal gathering shortly after the marriage, and remembered little beyond a pale, composed young woman who had said very few words the entire evening. The idea that this same woman was now the center of romantic whispers felt almost impossible to reconcile. That evening, when Roderick arrived at her townhouse for their usual quiet dinner, Charlotte found herself unable to resist raising the subject, though she chose her words with practiced care. "I heard an amusing story today," she said, pouring wine into his glass with steady hands. "Something about your wife and a certain baron." Roderick's expression, which had been relaxed and pleasant throughout their meal, shifted almost imperceptibly. "What story is that?" Charlotte relayed the tale as she had heard it, watching his face carefully for any reaction. To her surprise, and to his own, something flickered across his features that she had rarely seen there before, not indifference, as she might have expected, but something closer to discomfort, perhaps even displeasure. "I am certain it is nothing more than idle gossip," Charlotte added quickly, though she found herself curious about the reaction her words had provoked. "No doubt," Roderick said, though his voice had grown quieter, more distant. He finished his wine in silence, and though the evening continued as it always did, something in him had shifted, an unwelcome thought now lodged firmly in his mind that he could not seem to shake regardless of how he tried. Later that night, alone in his London townhouse, Roderick found himself staring at the fire rather than sleeping, turning the story over in his thoughts with a persistence that troubled him. He told himself repeatedly that it did not matter, that whatever companionship his wife sought was entirely her own business, given the state of their marriage. He had, after all, chosen his own distance from her years ago, for reasons he had never fully explained even to himself, let alone to her. It seemed hardly fair to begrudge her the same freedom he had claimed for himself. Yet the thought of another man walking beside her, making her laugh, calling upon her at Ashbourne Manor with growing frequency, settled into his chest like a stone he could not dislodge. He tried to identify the feeling, examining it with the same careful analysis he applied to matters of business and estate management, but found only confusion where clarity should have been. It was not, he told himself firmly, jealousy. He had no claim to feel jealous over a marriage he had abandoned in all but name, and yet the word lingered at the edges of his mind, regardless of how firmly he denied it. He thought, too, of Alara herself, a woman he realized with some discomfort he barely knew anymore. The image he carried of her was frozen in memory, a young bride of 19 standing beside him at their wedding, her hand small and trusting in his. He had not truly looked at her, truly spoken with her, in longer than he cared to admit. What had she become, in the years since he had left her to manage Ashbourne Manor alone? What kind of woman had emerged from the quiet, dutiful girl he had married, and then promptly forgotten? The questions unsettled him more than he expected, and sleep did not come easily that night. Meanwhile, at Ashbourne Manor, life had taken on a warmth that Alara had nearly forgotten was possible. Julian's visits, though officially concerned with matters of the estate, had grown into something both of them understood as courtship in all but formal name. He arrived twice, sometimes 3 times a week, always with some small reason prepared: a book he thought she might enjoy, advice for the steward regarding the autumn harvest, an invitation to accompany him on a walk through the eastern fields, where wildflowers still bloomed despite the cooling weather. Their conversations deepened with each visit, moving beyond pleasant small talk into more meaningful territory. Julian spoke of his years at sea with an honesty that revealed both the excitement and the loneliness of that life. The long stretches of isolation broken by moments of genuine camaraderie with his fellow officers. He spoke, too, of his late wife, Anne, who had passed 3 years earlier after a long illness, and the quiet grief that still lived somewhere within him, softened now by time, but never entirely gone. Alara found herself sharing more of her own truth than she had shared with anyone in years, even Margaret. She told him about the early days of her marriage, the brief hope she had carried on her wedding day, before it was extinguished by Roderick's sudden departure to war. She told him about the years that followed, the slow, painful process of learning to build a life around an absence rather than a presence, the loneliness that had become so familiar, it sometimes felt like the only companion she truly had. "I used to blame myself," she admitted one afternoon, as they walked together along the edge of the eastern fields, autumn leaves crunching softly beneath their feet. "I thought perhaps I had done something wrong, some flaw in my character that made me unworthy of his attention. It took me a long time to understand that his absence was not a reflection of my worth, but simply a choice he made, for reasons I may never fully understand." Julian stopped walking and turned to face her fully, his expression earnest and serious, in a way that made her breath catch slightly. "Alara, you must understand this clearly. Whatever reasons your husband has for his absence, they have nothing to do with your worth. Any man fortunate enough to call you his wife, and foolish enough to neglect that fortune, bears the full weight of that failure. None of it belongs to you." The sincerity in his voice, the quiet conviction behind his words, moved her more deeply than she expected. She had spent 5 years believing, at some deep and unspoken level, that she was simply not enough to hold a man's attention, that her husband's absence was somehow a verdict on her own value. Hearing Julian speak so plainly against that belief felt like a small crack of light breaking through a darkness she had lived within for far too long. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice unsteady. "You need not thank me for speaking the truth," Julian replied gently. They continued their walk in comfortable silence for a while, the autumn air crisp and clean around them, before Julian spoke again, his tone more careful this time. "I know your circumstances are complicated," he said. "I know you remain bound by marriage to a man who has, by his own choice, forfeited the right to your attention and affection. I do not wish to pressure you into anything you are not ready for, nor do I wish to be the cause of further scandal in your life. But I would be dishonest if I did not tell you that these past weeks, in your company, have brought me a happiness I had not expected to feel again after Anne's passing." Alara's heart raced at his words, a mixture of hope and fear tangling together in her chest. "Julian, You need not answer now," he said gently, cutting off her uncertain response with a reassuring smile. "I only wanted you to know the truth of my feelings. Whatever you decide to do with that knowledge, whatever path you choose for your own life, I will respect it entirely." She looked at him for a long moment, this kind and patient man who had, in the span of a few short weeks, given her more genuine warmth and consideration than her husband had offered in 5 long years. The comparison felt almost unfair to make, yet she could not help but make it, could not help but wonder what her life might have looked like had she married a man like Julian from the beginning, a man who chose presence over absence, attention over neglect. "I do not know what the future holds," she said finally, choosing her words with care. "My marriage remains a legal reality, regardless of how empty it has become in practice. I cannot simply set that aside without consequence, without careful thought about what any change might mean, not only for myself, but for the families still tied to this arrangement." "I understand," Julian said, and she could see in his expression that he truly did. "I am not asking you to make any decision today. I only ask that you allow me to remain in your life, as a friend, as a companion, for however long you need, while you find your own way forward." "I would like that," Elara said, and found that she meant it completely. As the weeks continued, their bond deepened further, built not on grand gestures but on countless small moments of genuine connection. Julian brought her a book of poetry he had found on one of his travels, its pages filled with verses about resilience and quiet hope. He remembered small details she mentioned only once: the name of her favorite flower, the fact that she preferred tea with just a touch of honey, the way she always paused thoughtfully before answering a difficult question. Elara, in turn, found herself looking forward to his visits, with an eagerness she had not felt in longer than she could remember, counting the days between them, finding herself disappointed on the rare occasions when his duties kept him away. Margaret, ever perceptive, watched the growing bond between them with quiet approval, though she occasionally offered gentle words of caution as well. "I am glad to see you happy again," she said one evening, as she helped Elara prepare for bed. "But I worry, my lady, about what will happen when the Duke learns of this. Word has a way of traveling, even from the quietest corners of the county." Elara had considered this worry herself, more than once, though she had pushed it aside each time in favor of simply enjoying the happiness she had found. "Roderick has made his choices clear for 5 years," she said, though her voice carried less certainty than her words suggested. "I do not see why my own choices should require his approval." "No," Margaret agreed. "But I fear a man does not always feel the same way about losing something he never valued, once he sees someone else preparing to claim it." The words settled uneasily in Elara's mind, a quiet warning she was not yet ready to fully consider, though she would come to understand their truth far sooner than she expected. For even as she and Julian continued to build their careful, hopeful bond at Ashbourne Manor, word of their growing closeness had already reached London, carried on whispers that had unsettled Roderick more deeply than he was willing to admit, even to himself. And somewhere in the quiet hours of another sleepless night, a decision was slowly forming in his mind, one that would soon bring him back to Ashbourne Manor for the first time in nearly a year, though not, this time, for reasons of business or duty, but for reasons he was only beginning to understand himself. Roderick's carriage arrived at Ashbourne Manor on a gray afternoon in late autumn, the wheels crunching over gravel that had not felt the weight of his return in nearly a year. He had sent word ahead, a brief note announcing his arrival to attend to what he described only as a state business, though the truth of his reasons remained tangled and unspoken, even within his own mind. Elara received the news of his impending arrival with a strange calm that surprised her. There had been a time, in the early years of their marriage, when the announcement of his return would have sent her into a flurry of anxious preparation, a desperate hope that this visit might finally be the one where he stayed, where he chose her, where the marriage became something real. That hope had long since faded, replaced by a steady practicality. She would receive him as Duchess and host, ensure his comfort during whatever business kept him at the manor, and return to the life she had built for herself once he departed again, as he inevitably would. She stood in the entrance hall as his carriage pulled to a stop, dressed in a deep blue gown that Margaret had helped her select that morning. Not for Roderick's benefit, she told herself firmly, but simply because it was a gown she liked. The staff had gathered as well, forming the customary line to greet their master upon his return, though the atmosphere carried none of the warmth one might expect from servants welcoming home a beloved employer. It was formal, correct, and entirely without feeling. Roderick stepped down from the carriage, and Elara found herself studying him with an objectivity she had not expected to feel. He looked older than she remembered, though only 5 years had passed. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that had not been there on their wedding day, a certain weariness in his posture that spoke of burdens he had never shared with her. He was still handsome, undeniably so, with the same dark hair and sharp features that had once made her heart flutter with youthful hope. But the sight of him now stirred nothing in her beyond a distant, almost clinical curiosity. "Elara," he said, approaching her with careful steps, as though uncertain of his welcome. "Roderick," she replied, offering a small, polite curtsy that carried none of the warmth a wife might normally extend to a returning husband, yet none of the coldness either. "Welcome home. I trust your journey was comfortable." "It was," he said, though his eyes lingered on her face with an intensity that felt unfamiliar, almost searching. "You look well." "Thank you," she said simply, turning to lead him toward the manor's entrance. "I have had the blue room prepared for you, as usual. Dinner will be served at 7, if that suits your schedule." The formality of her tone struck him more sharply than he expected. He had grown so accustomed to imagining Ashbourne Manor as a place frozen in time, waiting patiently for his eventual return, that the reality of Alara's composed, self-sufficient manner caught him entirely off guard. This was not the anxious, eager young bride he remembered from their earliest days together. This was a woman who managed his household, his estate, and apparently her own emotional life, with complete independence from him. Dinner that evening passed in careful, measured conversation. Roderick asked about the estate's affairs, and Alara answered with a thoroughness and competence that surprised him further still. She spoke of crop yields and tenant concerns, of repairs completed on the eastern cottages, of a new irrigation system she had commissioned after consulting with the steward and several local farmers. Her knowledge of matters he had once assumed were entirely beyond her interest or capability left him quietly, uncomfortably impressed. "You have managed a great deal in my absence," he said, after she finished describing the successful harvest from the previous season. "Someone had to," Alara replied, and though her tone carried no particular bitterness, the simple truth of the statement landed with unexpected weight. Roderick set down his fork, studying her across the long dinner table. "Alara, I know that I have been absent a great deal these past years. I have my reasons, though I confess they are not reasons I have shared with you, or with anyone, truly." Alara met his gaze steadily, something she would not have found the courage to do in earlier years. "You need not explain yourself to me, Roderick. We made an arrangement, and I have honored my part of it. What you choose to do with your own time and attention is your own affair." The coldness in her practical acceptance struck him harder than any accusation might have. He had expected, perhaps, tears, or anger, or desperate questions about his long absences and the rumors surrounding Charlotte Vane. Instead, he found only calm indifference, a wife who had clearly stopped waiting for him long ago, and built an entire life that no longer required his presence to feel complete. "I have heard," he said carefully, testing the ground, "that you have found companionship of your own during my absences." Something flickered across Alara's face, quickly controlled but not entirely hidden. "Baron Faircross has been a good friend to me these past weeks," she said evenly. "He has offered the steward valuable advice regarding the estate's agricultural matters." "Is that all he has offered?" Roderick asked, his voice carrying an edge he had not intended. Alara's chin lifted slightly, a small gesture of quiet defiance that he found himself admiring despite the discomfort of the moment. "I do not believe that question is yours to ask, given the circumstances of our marriage." The rebuke, gentle as it was, silenced him for a long moment. He knew, with uncomfortable clarity, that she was entirely correct. He had forfeited any right to question her choices the moment he had chosen, again and again, over 5 long years, to leave her alone at Ashbourne Manor while he pursued his own life in London. Whatever comfort she had found elsewhere was a direct consequence of his own neglect, and he had no honest ground upon which to object. "You are right," he said finally, the words costing him more than he expected. "Forgive me. I have no claim to question you on such matters." The dinner concluded shortly after, both of them retreating to their separate wings of the manor without further conversation. Yet as Roderick lay awake that night in the blue room, staring at the ceiling in the darkness, he found himself unable to stop thinking about the woman his wife had become. Gone was the timid, uncertain girl he had married. In her place stood a capable, composed woman who had built an entire world for herself, one that no longer needed him at its center. He tried to examine his own feelings honestly, a task he had avoided for years, by simply filling his time with distractions, with business, with Charlotte's easy company, that demanded nothing complicated of him. But here, in the quiet of Ashbourne Manor, surrounded by the life Alara had built without him, he could no longer avoid the uncomfortable truth that had been growing within him since he first heard the rumors of Julian Faircross. He was afraid. Afraid, he realized with startling clarity, of losing something he had never truly claimed in the first place. He thought of his own father, a man who had similarly neglected his mother throughout Roderick's childhood, choosing business and society over the quiet duties of family. Roderick had sworn, as a young man, that he would never repeat his father's mistakes, and yet here he was, having done precisely that, having driven away a wife through neglect, just as his father had done before him. The following morning, he found Alara in the manor's garden, tending to rows of late-blooming flowers with careful, practiced hands. She did not notice his approach at first, absorbed in her work, and he found himself simply watching her for a moment, this stranger who was somehow also his wife. There was a peace in her movements, a quiet contentment that he realized, with a fresh pang of guilt, he had played no part in creating. "The garden is beautiful," he said finally, announcing his presence. Elara looked up, brushing dirt from her hands as she rose to her feet. "Thank you. It has been a good source of comfort these past years." "I imagine you have needed such comfort," Roderick said quietly, "given how little of it I have provided." Elara studied him carefully, surprised by the honesty in his tone. It was not an admission she had expected from him, not after 5 years of silence and distance. "Why have you truly come back, Roderick? And do not tell me it is merely for estate business. I know this manor's ledgers well enough to know there is nothing here requiring your personal attention that could not have been resolved through correspondence." Roderick was quiet for a long moment, gathering thoughts he had never fully allowed himself to examine before. "I am not entirely certain myself," he admitted finally. "I only know that when I heard the stories of your growing friendship with Baron Faircross, something in me could not rest until I returned to see for myself what had changed." "And what have you found?" Elara asked, her voice steady despite the vulnerability of the question. "I have found a woman I barely recognize," Roderick said honestly. "A woman far stronger, far more capable, and far more admirable than the girl I married 5 years ago. And I find myself wondering, with some shame, whether I have any right left to call her my wife, in anything but name." The honesty of his words caught Elara off guard, stirring something complicated within her that she was not yet ready to examine fully. She had spent 5 years building walls around her heart, protecting herself from the pain of his indifference, and his sudden, unexpected vulnerability threatened to crack those walls in ways she was not prepared for. "I do not know what to say to that," she admitted quietly. "You need not say anything," Roderick replied. "I only wanted you to know that I see it now, the woman you have become, and the man I have failed to be for you these past years. Whatever happens between us going forward, I wanted you to hear that truth from me directly." They stood together in the garden for a long moment, the autumn air cool around them, both uncertain of what this new, unexpected honesty might mean for the future of a marriage that had existed, for 5 years, as little more than an arrangement on paper. Neither of them spoke of Julian Faircross again that morning, though the thought of him lingered unspoken between them, a quiet presence shaping the careful distance they both maintained, unsure yet of what path either of them truly wished to walk. Roderick remained at Ashbourne Manor longer than he had originally planned, extending his stay from a few days into nearly 2 weeks, much to the quiet surprise of the household staff who had grown accustomed to his brief and infrequent visits. He told himself, in the beginning, that he stayed simply to properly review the estate's affairs, to speak with the steward about matters he had long neglected, to reacquaint himself with responsibilities he had allowed his wife to carry alone for far too long. But as the days passed, he found himself staying for reasons that had far less to do with ledgers and crops, and far more to do with the quiet, unsettling pull of watching Elara move through her days. He began joining her on her morning walks through the gardens, at first offering polite conversation about the estate, and gradually finding their discussions drifting into more personal territory. She told him, cautiously at first, about the tenant families she had come to know over the years, about young children she had watched grow, about small triumphs and hardships she had witnessed and helped resolve. Roderick listened with a genuine interest that surprised them both, asking questions, remembering details, engaging with a curiosity he had never shown toward the estate's daily life before. Yet even as this fragile new connection began to form between them, Julian Faircross remained a steady, quiet presence in Elara's life, his visits continuing, despite Roderick's return, though with a noticeably more formal tone, now that the Duke himself was in residence. Julian arrived one afternoon during the second week of Roderick's stay, ostensibly to discuss the progress of the Eastern Fields' winter preparation with the steward, though both Elara and Roderick understood the true purpose of his continued attention. The two men met for the first time in the manor's drawing room, a meeting that Elara had dreaded for days, uncertain how either man would conduct himself in the other's presence. Roderick rose as Julian entered, extending a hand with careful, practiced civility. "Baron Faircross," he said. I understand you have been a great help to my wife and to the estate during my absence. Julian shook his hand firmly, his expression polite but unreadable. Your Grace, it has been my honor to offer what assistance I could. The Duchess has managed the estate admirably in your absence, though I am certain she would have welcomed your presence far more than my occasional advice. The subtle edge in Julian's words was not lost on Roderick, who found himself, despite his own guilt and uncertainty, feeling a flare of something close to resentment at the other man's implied criticism. Yet he could not deny the truth of it, and so he simply nodded, accepting the quiet rebuke without argument. You are correct, Roderick said. I have been remiss in my duties, both to my estate and to my wife. I hope to remedy that, going forward. Julian studied him for a long moment, something assessing in his gaze, before offering a small, measured nod. That would be welcome news, Your Grace, for the Duchess's sake, if nothing else. The conversation that followed remained carefully civil, the two men discussing matters of the estate with polite formality, while Alara sat between them, acutely aware of the tension simmering beneath the surface of their measured words. She found herself torn in ways she had not anticipated, watching Roderick engage with genuine interest in matters he had once dismissed entirely, while also recognizing the steady warmth and reliability that Julian had offered her so consistently these past weeks. After Julian departed that afternoon, Roderick remained quiet for a long while, staring out the drawing-room window at the departing carriage. He cares for you deeply, he said finally, not quite a question. He has been a good friend, Alara replied carefully. I think he is more than that, to both of you, Roderick said, turning to face her directly. And I think you know that as well as I do. Alara did not deny it, unwilling to lie about something so evidently true. Julian has offered me a kindness and attention that I had nearly forgotten was possible to receive from another person. I will not apologize for valuing that. I am not asking you to apologize, Roderick said quietly. I am simply trying to understand where that leaves us, Alara, where it leaves this marriage, and what remains of it worth saving. The question hung heavily in the air between them, neither entirely prepared to answer it fully. Alara found herself studying her husband, searching for the sincerity behind his words, uncertain whether this sudden attentiveness was born of genuine change or simply the wounded pride of a man unwilling to lose something he had never properly valued until threatened with its loss. I do not know the answer to that yet, she admitted honestly. 5 years of silence cannot be undone in 2 weeks of conversation, Roderick. I need time to understand what I truly feel and what I truly want before I can answer such a question honestly. That is fair, Roderick said, though the words seemed to cost him something. I will not push you toward an answer before you are ready to give one. I only ask that you allow me the chance to show you, through my actions rather than my words, that I am capable of change. In the days that followed, Roderick made good on that promise in small but meaningful ways. He rose early to accompany the steward on visits to the tenant farms, taking a genuine interest in the concerns of families he had never before troubled himself to know by name. He sat with Alara in the evenings, not simply making polite conversation, but truly listening to her thoughts on matters both large and small, asking her opinion on estate decisions he would once have made entirely without her input. He wrote to Charlotte Vane, ending their long arrangement with a careful, honest letter that acknowledged the unfairness of the position he had placed her in for so long. Alara watched these changes with cautious hope, wanting desperately to believe in the man Roderick seemed to be becoming, while remaining wary of trusting too quickly in a transformation that might prove temporary once the immediate threat of losing her had passed. She continued her friendship with Julian as well, unwilling to abandon the genuine connection they had built, simply because Roderick had suddenly decided to pay attention to a marriage he had ignored for 5 long years. Julian, for his part, remained patient and understanding, though Alara could sense the quiet difficulty he faced in watching Roderick's renewed attention toward her. During one of his visits, as they walked together through the gardens Alara had so carefully tended, Julian finally voiced the concern he had been carrying. I will not pretend that watching the Duke's changed behavior does not trouble me, he said honestly. I have come to care for you deeply, Alara, in a way that has surprised even myself. I fear, watching him now, that I may lose the chance to build a future with you before it has even properly begun. Alara stopped walking, turning to face him fully. Julian, I owe you honesty above all else. I do not know what the future holds for my marriage, Roderick's recent efforts have been genuine, as far as I can tell, though 5 years of neglect cannot simply be erased by a few weeks of attentiveness. I need time to understand my own heart before I can offer either of you a fair answer." "I understand," Julian said, though the disappointment in his voice was evident despite his attempt to mask it. "I only ask that whatever you decide, you choose based on what will truly bring you happiness, rather than obligation, or duty, or fear of scandal. You deserve a life built on genuine love, Ilara, whether that life includes me or not." The sincerity of his words moved her deeply, further complicating the uncertainty already tangled in her heart. She found herself caught between two men who each, in their own way, offered her something she had long craved. Roderick offered the possibility of redeeming a marriage that had once held real promise, of building something meaningful from the ashes of 5 wasted years. Julian offered steady, proven devotion, a love built not on obligation, but on genuine choice and mutual respect from the very beginning. That evening, as Ilara sat alone in her private sitting room, turning the events of recent weeks over in her mind, Margaret found her staring into the fire with an expression of deep contemplation. "You look troubled, my lady," Margaret said gently, settling into the chair across from her. "I do not know what to do, Margaret," Ilara admitted. "Roderick has changed, or seems to have changed, in ways I never expected to witness. And Julian has offered me a kindness and devotion I had nearly forgotten was possible. I find myself torn between the marriage I once hoped for and the love I have found unexpectedly in its shadow." Margaret considered this carefully before responding. "Perhaps, my lady, the question is not which man deserves your heart, but which future truly serves your own happiness. You have spent 5 years building a life around duty and obligation. Perhaps it is time, finally, to choose for yourself, rather than for what others expect of you." The words settled deeply within Ilara, a truth she had perhaps always known, but had never allowed herself to fully embrace. As the fire crackled softly before her, she found herself beginning, for the first time in her adult life, to seriously consider what she truly wanted, separate from the expectations of family, society, or even the two men whose futures had become so unexpectedly entangled with her own. It was a question that would take her many more weeks to answer fully, weeks that would bring further complications, further tests of loyalty and love, before the true path forward finally became clear. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing Ashbourne Manor and the surrounding countryside in a thick layer of snow that transformed the familiar landscape into something quiet and unfamiliar. Roderick had extended his stay through the changing season, his visits to London growing shorter and less frequent, though he had not yet fully abandoned his old life there. Ilara watched this gradual shift with cautious optimism, still uncertain whether the change represented genuine transformation or simply a temporary response to the fear of losing her. Julian continued his own visits as well, though the snow made travel more difficult, and his appearances grew less frequent through the winter months. Each time he did arrive at Ashbourne Manor, bundled against the cold with cheeks reddened from the journey, Ilara felt a familiar warmth rise within her, a reminder of the genuine connection they had built together, one that had not diminished despite Roderick's renewed presence in her life. It was on a particularly cold afternoon in late January that Julian arrived at Ashbourne Manor with a purpose different from his usual visits. He requested a private audience with Ilara, and something in his careful, formal tone told her that this conversation would carry more weight than their usual pleasant discussions of books and gardens and estate matters. They sat together in the small library Ilara had built over the years, a fire crackling warmly in the hearth as snow fell steadily outside the tall windows. Julian seemed unusually nervous, turning his hat over in his hands, before finally setting it aside and meeting her eyes directly. "Ilara, I have thought carefully about what I wish to say to you today," he began, his voice steady, despite the evident emotion behind his words. "I know that your circumstances remain complicated, that you are still bound by marriage to Roderick, and that he has, in recent months, made genuine efforts to become the husband he failed to be for so many years. I respect that complexity, and I have tried, throughout these past months, to give you the space you need to determine your own heart. You have been remarkably patient," Ilara said softly, appreciating the truth of his words. "Patience has not always come easily," Julian admitted with a small, rueful smile. but I care for you too deeply to rush you toward a decision you are not ready to make. However, I find that I can no longer simply wait in silence, watching this uncertainty stretch on indefinitely, without at least making clear the depth of my feelings and the future I hope we might build together." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box, and Alara felt her breath catch in her throat, uncertain of what exactly he intended, given her still married status. "I am not asking you to marry me today," Julian clarified quickly, seeming to sense her uncertainty. "I know that would be impossible, given your current circumstances. But I wish to formally declare my intentions. Alara, if you find, after careful consideration, that your heart no longer belongs to your marriage, that you wish instead to build a future, free from an arrangement that brought you so much loneliness and pain, I want you to know that I will be here, waiting, however long it takes for the proper legal proceedings to unfold. I will seek an annulment on your behalf if you wish it, citing the abandonment you endured for 5 long years. And when that process concludes, I would be honored beyond words to make you my wife, properly, through a marriage built on genuine love and mutual choice rather than family obligation." He opened the small box to reveal a delicate ring, simple but beautifully crafted, clearly chosen with careful thought and consideration for her own understated tastes. Alara stared at it, her mind racing through the implications of what he was offering, a genuine chance at the kind of marriage she had once dreamed of as a young bride, before 5 years of neglect had taught her to abandon such hopes entirely. "Julian, I do not know what to say," she admitted, her voice unsteady with the weight of the moment. "You need not answer today," he said gently, closing the box but pressing it into her hands regardless. "I only wanted you to have this, as a reminder of my intentions, whenever you feel ready to make your choice. Whether that choice ultimately favors a renewed marriage with Roderick, or a new beginning with me, I want you to know that you are deeply valued, Alara, by at least one man in this world who sees you clearly and loves you completely." Alara held the small box carefully in her hands long after Julian had departed that evening, sitting alone in the quiet library as the fire slowly burned down to embers and the snow continued falling steadily outside. She thought of the 5 lonely years that had preceded this moment, of the countless nights she had spent wondering if she was simply unworthy of genuine love and attention. Julian's declaration, however carefully and patiently offered, represented everything she had once believed impossible for herself. Yet even as she turned the ring over in her hands, admiring its simple beauty, she found herself thinking of Roderick as well, of the genuine effort he had shown these past months, of conversations that had grown steadily more honest and meaningful between them, of small moments of connection that had begun, slowly and carefully, to rebuild something she had once believed entirely lost. Word of Julian's visit and its evident significance reached Roderick before the evening had fully concluded, carried through the quiet observations of household staff, who had noticed the Baron's nervous demeanor upon arrival, and the emotional weight evident in Alara's expression afterward. Roderick found her still sitting in the library, the small velvet box resting on the table beside her. "May I ask what happened this afternoon?" he said carefully, noting the box but not immediately reaching for it. Alara considered deflecting the question, protecting the privacy of Julian's declaration, but she had grown weary of secrets and half-truths over the years, and something in her wished, finally, for complete honesty between them, regardless of the discomfort it might cause. "Julian has asked me to consider a future together," she said simply. "Once proper legal proceedings could dissolve this marriage, on grounds of your long abandonment." Roderick was quiet for a long moment, processing this information, with visible effort to control his reaction. "And what have you decided?" "I have not decided anything yet," Alara said honestly. "I asked him for time, and he has graciously granted it." Roderick nodded slowly, though something had clearly shifted within him, a fresh urgency evident in the tension of his posture. "Alara, I understand that I have no right to ask this of you, given everything I have failed to provide these past 5 years, but I am asking regardless, because I find I cannot simply stand aside and watch you walk toward another man without at least fighting for what remains between us, however small that remainder might be." "What are you asking, Roderick?" Alara said, her voice carrying genuine uncertainty about what answer she hoped to hear. "I am asking for the chance to properly explain myself," Roderick said, his voice carrying an emotional weight she had rarely heard from him before. "I have spoken these past months of change, of genuine effort, But I have never fully explained the reasons behind my absence these 5 years. I owe you that explanation, Ilara, however difficult it may be for me to give it. And I believe, once you hear it, you deserve the chance to decide your future, with full knowledge of everything that shaped our marriage's difficult beginning. Ilara studied her husband carefully, noting the genuine vulnerability in his expression, so different from the cold formality that had characterized their marriage for so many years. Then tell me, she said quietly. Tell me everything, Roderick. I believe I have earned that much, after 5 years of silence. Roderick took a steadying breath, settling into the chair across from her as the fire crackled softly between them, the small velvet box still resting on the table as a quiet reminder of the choice that lay ahead of her. What followed was a confession 5 years in the making, one that would finally reveal the truth behind his prolonged absence, a truth rooted not in indifference toward her, as she had long believed, but in a wound from the war he had carried silently, believing himself too broken and unworthy to properly share his life with the young bride he had married in haste before departing for battle. He spoke of the friends he had lost during those 2 years of fighting along the northern border, of the guilt that had settled permanently in his chest when he alone returned home, while others did not. He spoke of the nightmares that had plagued him in the months following his return, of a darkness within himself that he had feared would poison anything good he tried to build, including the marriage he had entered with such hopeful intentions on their wedding day. He had told himself, in his confused and grieving state, that distance would protect her from witnessing the broken man he had become, that his absence was a form of misguided protection, rather than simple neglect. I know now how wrong I was, he said finally, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. I know that my absence caused you far more pain than my presence, however broken I might have been, ever could have. I have spent these past months trying to understand how to properly ask for your forgiveness, knowing full well that I may not deserve it, given the years of loneliness I forced upon you. Ilara listened to this confession with a complicated mixture of emotions, the anger and hurt of 5 lonely years mingling with a genuine compassion for the pain Roderick had clearly carried in silence for far too long. She understood now, with painful clarity, that his neglect had never truly been about her worth or her failures as a wife, but about a private struggle he had never learned to properly navigate or share. Why did you never simply tell me? She asked softly. I would have tried to understand, Roderick. I would have wanted to help you through it, rather than being pushed away. I know that now, Roderick admitted, but at the time, I could not see past my own guilt and shame. I believed, foolishly, that protecting you from my struggles was somehow noble, rather than simply another form of abandonment. I understand now how deeply that decision failed you, and I carry that failure with genuine and lasting regret. The library fell silent between them, both processing the weight of this long overdue honesty, the small velvet box still resting on the table, as a quiet reminder that this conversation, however meaningful, had not yet resolved the fundamental choice still awaiting Ilara's decision. She found herself, for the first time in this entire unfolding drama, uncertain not of her feelings for either man, but of what path truly represented the life she wished to build for herself, now that both possibilities had been laid so completely and honestly before her. The weeks following Roderick's confession passed slowly for Ilara, each day bringing fresh consideration of the choice that lay before her. She found herself unable to simply dismiss either man from her heart, torn between the steady, proven devotion Julian had offered so consistently, and the newly revealed vulnerability of a husband she was only now beginning to truly understand, after 5 years of marriage in name alone. Roderick, for his part, continued to demonstrate the changes he had promised, though he no longer pressed her for any immediate decision, seeming to understand that such pressure would only complicate an already difficult choice. He remained at Ashbourne Manor throughout the winter, taking on genuine responsibility for the estate's affairs, working alongside the steward with real dedication, rather than the distant oversight he had once offered. He wrote letters to old army companions he had long avoided, slowly working through the guilt and grief he had carried silently for so many years, sometimes sharing pieces of these conversations with Ilara in the quiet evenings they now regularly spent together. She watched him carefully during these months, searching for any sign that his transformation might be temporary, a performance offered only to prevent the loss of something he had suddenly realized he valued. But the changes appeared consistent and genuine, extending even to moments when he believed himself unobserved. Small kindnesses offered to the household staff, patient attention given to tenant concerns that required no audience to witness his effort. Julian's visits continued as well, though with a respectful distance now that acknowledged the complexity of Alara's situation. He never pressed her for an answer, never spoke again of the ring he had left in her keeping, trusting instead that she would come to him when, and if, she was ready to make her choice known. Yet his patience did not diminish the genuine warmth of their continued friendship, nor the quiet ache Alara felt each time he departed. Uncertain when his kindness might finally require an answer she was not yet prepared to give. It was in early spring, as the snow finally began to melt and the first green shoots emerged in the gardens Alara had tended so carefully over the years, that circumstances forced the question toward its inevitable resolution. Charlotte Vane, whose relationship with Roderick had ended months earlier through his careful and honest letter, arrived unexpectedly at Ashbourne Manor, having traveled from London with news she felt compelled to deliver in person. Alara received her with the polite formality expected between two women whose lives had been complicated by the same man, though a mutual, unspoken understanding existed between them, an acknowledgement that neither held true resentment toward the other, given the circumstances that had bound them both to Roderick in different ways. "I have not come to cause difficulty," Charlotte said carefully, once they were settled in the drawing room with tea between them. "I have come because I believe you deserve to know something, given the decision I understand you are currently weighing." Alara studied her guest with careful attention. "What is it you wish to tell me?" "Roderick's letter to me, ending our arrangement, was not written out of mere convenience or shifting affection," Charlotte said. "I have known Roderick for 3 years, and I have watched him struggle silently with grief and guilt from his time in the war. Struggles he shared with almost no one, myself included, beyond the barest acknowledgement that such wounds existed. When his letter arrived, explaining his intention to properly repair his marriage, to finally face the truths he had avoided for so long, I recognized in his words a sincerity I had never witnessed from him before, not in 3 years of acquaintance." Alara listened carefully, uncertain what to make of this unexpected testimony from a woman she might have once considered a rival for her husband's affection. "Why tell me this now?" "Because I believe you deserve to make your decision with full and honest information," Charlotte said simply. "I have no claim left on Roderick's affections, nor do I wish to reclaim one, but I have witnessed enough of this situation to believe that his change is genuine, however difficult that transformation has clearly been for him. I only wished you to know that truth, from someone who has no remaining stake in influencing your choice toward himself." The visit left Alara with much to consider, Charlotte's unexpected honesty adding another layer of complexity to a decision that already felt overwhelming in its weight and consequence. She found herself walking alone through the gardens that evening, the first tender growth of spring pushing through soil that had been frozen for months, much like her own heart, she realized, slowly thawing after years of careful protection against further pain. It was during this solitary walk that Roderick found her, approaching with careful steps that respected her evident need for quiet reflection. "I understand Charlotte visited today," he said gently, settling beside her on the garden bench without pressing too closely. "She did," Alara confirmed. "She spoke well of the changes she has witnessed in you." Roderick nodded slowly, seeming unsurprised by this news. "I wrote to her, months ago, to properly end things between us, and to apologize for the unfair position I had placed her in, throughout our acquaintance. I do not know what she said to you today, but I hope you understand that whatever occurred between Charlotte and myself was never truly about affection or love, but about my own avoidance of the deeper work I needed to do within myself." "She said as much," Alara replied. "She believes your transformation is genuine." "And what do you believe?" Roderick asked carefully, his voice carrying the weight of genuine vulnerability rather than desperate pleading. Alara considered the question seriously before answering, wanting to offer him the same honesty he had finally offered her. "I believe you have changed, Roderick. I have watched these past months, and I see genuine effort, genuine growth, a man working to understand and heal from wounds he carried silently for far too long. I no longer believe your absence these 5 years reflected any true lack of value in myself, and I understand now the private battle you were fighting throughout that time." "But," Roderick said, sensing the unspoken continuation in her measured response, "but Understanding your reasons does not erase the years of loneliness I endured because of them, Elara said honestly. Forgiveness and trust are not the same thing, Roderick. I find that I can offer you genuine forgiveness for the pain of those 5 years, understanding now the depth of struggle you were navigating. But trust, the kind of trust required to fully rebuild a marriage, that must be earned again, slowly, through continued demonstration rather than words alone. Roderick absorbed this response with visible acceptance rather than defensive protest, recognizing the fairness in what she asked of him. I understand that fully, Elara. I do not expect trust to be freely given after 5 years of failing to earn it. I only hope you will allow me the continued opportunity to demonstrate, through consistent action over time, that the man I am becoming deserves a genuine chance at rebuilding what our marriage might have been from the very beginning. Elara asked softly, voicing the name that had remained a quiet, constant presence throughout this entire unfolding situation. Roderick was quiet for a long moment before responding, and when he did, his voice carried a genuine humility that surprised her. I cannot fault you for whatever feelings you carry for him, Elara. He has offered you a kindness and consistency that I failed to provide, during the years when it mattered most. If your heart ultimately belongs with him, I will not stand in the way of your happiness, however difficult that acceptance might be for me personally. I only ask that whatever choice you make it based on your own genuine desires, rather than obligation to either of us, or fear of the scandal that either choice might bring. The genuine selflessness of this statement moved Elara more deeply than she expected, a final piece of evidence supporting the sincerity of Roderick's transformation. She sat quietly beside her husband in the fading evening light, the garden around them slowly awakening from winter's long sleep, and found herself, finally, beginning to understand with true clarity what her own heart truly wanted, separate from the expectations and pressures that had shaped so much of her difficult journey these past 5 years. I need a few more days, she said finally, to be certain of my own heart, before I offer either of you a final answer. Take whatever time you need, Roderick said gently. I have waited 5 years to properly value what I have in you, Elara. I can certainly wait a few more days to learn whether that value will be given the chance to grow into something real. They sat together in comfortable silence, as darkness settled fully over the garden, both aware that the coming days would finally bring resolution to a situation that had tested the hearts and patience of everyone involved. Elara returned to her chambers that evening with a clarity slowly forming within her, a decision taking shape that would require careful conversation with both men who had, in their own distinct ways, shown her that she was worthy of genuine love and attention. A truth she had nearly forgotten during the long, lonely years of her forgotten marriage. Elara spent the following days in careful, quiet reflection, walking often through the gardens that had become her sanctuary over the years, seeking clarity in the familiar rhythm of the estate she had come to love so deeply. She thought back over the entire journey that had brought her to this moment, from the lonely years of neglect that had nearly convinced her of her own unworthiness, to the unexpected warmth she had found at the county fair, to the painful but necessary honesty that had finally emerged between herself and Roderick. She thought of Julian's patient devotion, offered freely, without demand or pressure, a love built on genuine choice from its very first conversation, beside a stall of old books. He had shown her, through months of consistent kindness, exactly what it felt like to be truly seen and valued by another person, a gift she would carry with gratitude, regardless of the path she ultimately chose. She thought, too, of Roderick's painful but genuine transformation, the slow unveiling of a man who had carried private wounds in silence for far too long, mistakenly believing that distance protected her from a darkness he feared would poison everything he touched. His confession had revealed not indifference toward her, as she had believed for 5 painful years, but a broken man struggling to find his way back to himself before he could properly offer anything real to his marriage. Margaret found her one evening in the library, sitting quietly with Julian's small velvet box resting once again on the table before her, the ring catching the firelight in a soft, steady glow. "Have you decided, my lady?" Margaret asked gently, settling into her usual chair. "I believe I have," Elara said slowly, "though I confess the decision has not come easily." "Tell me," Margaret encouraged softly. Elara considered her words carefully before speaking, wanting to articulate a truth that had only recently become fully clear to her own heart. For 5 years, I believed my worth was measured by my husband's attention, or lack thereof. I believed that being chosen, being wanted, was the ultimate proof of my value as a person. When Julian entered my life, offering the attention and devotion I had craved for so long, I believed perhaps that he represented my chance at finally proving that worth, at finally being properly chosen by someone. She paused, gathering her thoughts further. But these past months have taught me something different. I have learned that my worth was never truly dependent on either man's choice to value me. I built an entire life at Ashbourne Manor during my loneliest years, a life of purpose and meaning, entirely separate from my marriage. That life proved my worth long before either Roderick's transformation or Julian's devotion arrived to confirm it. That is a wise realization, Margaret said softly. It has freed me, I think, to make this choice, based on genuine desire rather than fear or obligation, Alara continued. I care for Julian deeply, and I will always hold gratitude for the kindness he showed me during my loneliest years. But I have come to understand that my heart, despite everything, remains tied to Roderick, not out of duty or obligation, but because I have witnessed in him a genuine capacity for growth and change that I believe in fully. The marriage we began 5 years ago was built on necessity rather than love, but I believe now that we have the opportunity to build something entirely different, something chosen freely by both of us, going forward. Margaret listened with quiet understanding, recognizing the genuine conviction behind Alara's words. And Julian, how will you tell him? With honesty and gratitude, Alara said. He deserves nothing less, after everything he has offered me. The following morning, Alara requested that Julian visit Ashbourne Manor one final time, sending word through the steward that she was finally prepared to offer him the answer he had so patiently awaited these past months. He arrived that afternoon, his expression carrying a careful hope tempered by evident uncertainty about what her decision might ultimately be. They walked together through the gardens, now fully awakened with the fresh growth of early spring, the same path they had walked so many times during the months of their careful courtship. Alara chose her words with great care, wanting to honor the genuine connection they had built while being honest about the path her heart had ultimately chosen. Julian, I owe you more gratitude than words can properly express, she began. You entered my life during its loneliest chapter, and you offered me something I had nearly forgotten was possible: genuine kindness, patient devotion, and the simple gift of being truly seen and valued. I will carry that gift with me for the rest of my life, regardless of what path I choose to walk. Julian's expression grew careful, sensing the direction of her words even before she fully voiced them. But your heart belongs to Roderick, he said quietly, not quite a question. I believe it does, Alara confirmed gently. I have watched him change these past months in ways I believe are genuine and lasting. I believe we have the chance to build something real between us, something chosen freely rather than born of family obligation. I know this news brings you pain, and I am deeply sorry for that. You deserve every happiness in this world, Julian, and I hope you will find a love that matches the depth of devotion you so generously offered me. Julian was quiet for a long moment, processing the weight of her words with visible effort to maintain his composure. I cannot pretend this does not bring me sorrow, he admitted finally. I had allowed myself to hope for a future with you, Alara, and letting go of that hope will not come easily. But I respect your honesty, and I respect the courage it took to reach this decision, after everything you have endured. I only wish for your genuine happiness, whatever form that ultimately takes. Thank you, Julian, Alara said softly, tears gathering in her eyes at the genuine grace of his response. Your friendship has meant more to me than I can properly express. Then let us remain friends, Julian said, offering a small, sincere smile, despite the evident pain behind it. I would rather have your friendship for the remainder of my life than lose you entirely from it. I would like that very much, Alara agreed, grateful for his generous spirit, even in this moment of disappointment. Julian returned the small velvet box to his coat pocket that afternoon, though he left Ashbourne Manor with his dignity and grace fully intact, a testament to the genuine character that had drawn Alara to him in the first place, even as her heart had ultimately chosen a different path forward. That evening, Alara found Roderick in the Manor's library, reading quietly by the fire as had become their comfortable habit these past months. He looked up as she entered, something hopeful and uncertain evident in his expression, as he noted the particular purpose in her steps. "I have made my decision," she said simply, settling into the chair across from him. Roderick set aside his book, giving her his complete attention. "And what have you decided?" "I have decided to give our marriage a genuine chance," Elara said, watching relief and joy spread across his features in equal measure. "Not out of obligation, Roderick, and not out of fear of scandal or duty to family expectations. I choose this because I have witnessed real change in you these past months, and I believe we have the opportunity to build something entirely different from the empty arrangement that defined our first 5 years together." "Elara," Roderick said, his voice thick with genuine emotion, "I promise you, with complete sincerity, that I will spend whatever years remain to us, proving myself worthy of this chance you are offering. I will not repeat the mistakes of our past. You have my complete and honest devotion, starting from this very moment forward. I will hold you to that promise," Elara said, though her voice carried warmth rather than warning. "Trust will need to be rebuilt slowly, Roderick, through consistent action over time, but I believe, finally, that we can build it together." Roderick reached for her hand, and this time, unlike the formal courtesy of their wedding day 5 years earlier, the gesture carried genuine warmth and connection between two people who had finally, after so much difficulty and pain, found their way back to something real. Outside the library windows, spring continued its steady progress across the grounds of Ashbourne Manor, the gardens Elara had tended through her loneliest years, now blooming fully, a fitting reflection of the new beginning, quietly taking root within the marriage she had once believed entirely lost. In the months that followed, Roderick made good on his promise, choosing Ashbourne Manor and his wife's company over the distant distractions of London society that had once consumed so much of his time and attention. Their marriage, rebuilt slowly and carefully on a foundation of genuine honesty and mutual respect, grew into something neither of them had believed possible during those 5 painful years of separation and neglect. Elara continued tending her gardens, managing the estate's affairs alongside her husband rather than entirely alone, and slowly, steadily, allowing herself to trust in the genuine love that had finally, after so much difficulty, found its way into a marriage that had once seemed forgotten entirely. A full year passed at Ashbourne Manor, and the change within its walls was evident to everyone who had known the estate during its quieter, lonelier years. Roderick had kept his promise with a steadiness that surprised even those who had watched his transformation unfold slowly through the previous winter and spring. He no longer traveled to London, except for necessary matters that genuinely required his presence, and even then, he returned home as quickly as his duties allowed, unwilling to waste time away from the wife, and the life he had nearly lost through years of careless neglect. Elara found herself, in this new season of her marriage, discovering a happiness she had once believed entirely beyond her reach. She and Roderick worked together now on the estate's affairs, his growing respect for her capability evident in the way he sought her counsel on decisions both large and small. Their evenings, once filled with silence and distance, now carried genuine warmth, long conversations by the fire, shared laughter over small moments in their day, a partnership built finally on equal footing, rather than the imbalanced arrangement of their marriage's difficult beginning. Margaret remained a steady presence throughout this transformation, her quiet wisdom having guided Elara through the most difficult choices of the previous year. She often remarked, with evident satisfaction, on how different the manor felt now, filled with genuine warmth, rather than the careful, polite distance that had once characterized every interaction between the Duke and Duchess. Julian, true to his word, remained a friend to Elara throughout the following months, their friendship settling into a comfortable, respectful distance that honored both the connection they had once shared and the different path her heart had ultimately chosen. He visited Ashbourne Manor occasionally, though less frequently than before, and Elara was genuinely pleased to learn, through mutual acquaintances, that he had begun courting a widow from a neighboring county, a woman known for her gentle spirit and quiet intelligence. She wrote to him with sincere congratulations when his engagement was formally announced, grateful to know that his own capacity for love had found a home worthy of the devotion he had once offered so freely to her. Charlotte Vane, too, found her own path forward, eventually marrying a widowed merchant she had met through mutual London acquaintances, a match built on genuine companionship rather than the complicated arrangement that had once bound her to Roderick. Elara received word of the marriage with genuine goodwill, understanding now, with the clarity that only comes from surviving one's own difficult journey, that every person deserved the chance to find real happiness, regardless of the complicated paths that might lead them there. As the second year of their renewed marriage began, Elara discovered she was carrying their first child, news that filled Ashbourne Manor with a joy it had not known in generations. Roderick's excitement was evident in every gesture, every careful attention he paid to her comfort throughout the months that followed, a stark contrast to the distant husband who had once left her alone on their very wedding night. He read to her in the evenings, accompanied her on gentle walks through the gardens she had tended so faithfully through her loneliest years, and spoke often, with genuine wonder, of the family they were finally building together. Their daughter arrived on a warm morning in early summer, and Roderick wept openly upon holding her for the first time, overwhelmed by a joy he had once believed himself too broken to properly feel. Elara watched her husband with their newborn daughter, and felt, in that quiet moment, the full weight of how far they had traveled together. From the cold formality of a wedding day marked by immediate abandonment, through 5 years of painful loneliness, to this tender, hard-won happiness that neither of them had believed possible during the darkest years of their marriage. The gardens at Ashbourne Manor continued to bloom each season, tended now by Elara with the help of her young daughter, who grew quickly to share her mother's love of growing things. The estate flourished under the combined management of Duke and Duchess, its tenant families thriving under attention and care that both Roderick and Elara now offered together, rather than the solitary burden Elara had once carried alone through her loneliest years. Looking back on the journey that had brought her to this hard-won happiness, Elara often thought of that autumn afternoon at the county fair, the chance meeting beside a stall of old books that had set in motion a chain of events neither she nor anyone else could have properly predicted. She thought, too, of the painful years of loneliness that had preceded that meeting, years she no longer viewed with bitterness, but with a quiet gratitude for the strength and resilience they had taught her, qualities that had ultimately allowed her to build the genuine happiness she now enjoyed. She had learned, through the most difficult chapter of her life, that her worth had never truly depended on being chosen by another person, that the life she built for herself, during her loneliest years, had proven her value, long before either man's attention arrived to confirm it. This understanding had given her the strength to make her final choice based on genuine desire rather than fear or obligation, and it continued to serve as the foundation for the happy, equal partnership she now shared with the husband who had once forgotten her, but who had ultimately found his way back, choosing her fully and completely, exactly as she had always deserved to be chosen. Ashbourne Manor, once a place of quiet loneliness and forgotten promises, had become instead a home filled with genuine warmth, laughter, and love, a testament to the truth that even the most painful beginnings could, with courage, honesty, and patience, transform into something beautiful, beyond anything either Elara or Roderick had once believed possible for themselves.